it'll probably take 2 or 3 weeks to go through. But what I'd like to look at is maybe we've seen Pastor Jock go through an overview of, you know, the promises made to Israel and how they would migrate from the east to the west, which corresponds, as he mentioned, with what most people would believe in historical circles. Obviously, I'm not a historian, and this is more just again to prove, you know, what God says in his word, we believe has come to pass. And we'll see the migration of people, in particular, gone from the Levant, which is the Middle East, known as Israel, Syria, that kind of area, how they moved through Greece onto northern Spain in particular, and for us then into the British Isles, and in particular maybe looking at 1 or 2 tribes that particularly went into Ireland. So what we might do is just a little recap. So hopefully you can see that there was a number of different covenants made in the Old Testament.
Sorry, Anthony, we can't see the screen. We can't see anything. We can just see you. We can see you.
Hold on, the share screen's gone, is it?
It must be.
You see now?
Yes.
Okay. So you haven't missed anything. Just
No.
on the next one, I'm going to play a video, so let me know that you can hear it. So in this is there's a number of different covenants, and some of them were unconditional, and some of them, of course, were conditional. And in particular, is this promise that God would move his people into different lands. You know, we might flick through those scriptures in a couple of slides time. But even when David came to the throne, the Lord said that he would move them to an appointed place, which is quite amazing, because when he actually united the country, the Lord said, I've appointed a place for you. And further on in Isaiah, it talks about the Isles of the West, which in particular, Pastor Jock went through. So we're just going to recap for the sake of it, and hopefully this video plays. It's just the family tree of Jacob before we go anywhere. So I'm going to play this. Hopefully it works. You hear that?
Yep.
There's a bit of a loud noise at the end. So that kind of gives us just a quick recap. I know it's quite quick, and I won't do any quizzes on it at the minute, but it kind of gives you a feel for the Jacob's family. And what we're going to look in particular is maybe 1 or 2 of those tribes. In particular, we're going to look at Simeon and maybe a little bit of Daniel. And it'll also touch a little bit on Judah. So here's some of the emblems or the heraldry that are associated with the tribes. And in particular for Ireland is the Judah, the Zarah-Judah in particular, and Simeon David obviously is linked with Judah, and obviously then the other one is Dan. Where is he? There he is there. He's not here tonight, but his emblem is. And just in particular, we'll see this sword and the castle that represent the tribe of Simeon. And we'll just look at a bit of the character of Simeon. So some of us know the story of when Simeon and Levi are actually natural brothers. So when we looked at that family tree, these are actually biological brothers. They're not like from different mothers. They're from the same mother. And they had a sister, Dinah, who was, if you like, abused by a guy as they passed through on their journey. And Simeon and Levi are quite hot-headed. As it says, this is Jacob referring to that particular situation. He says, Simeon and his brother Levi took violent revenge against the inhabitants of the city by tricking them into circumcising themselves and then killing them when they are weakened. So they're kind of a bit hot-headed, and violence is a streak that can be in them. The primary significance of this particular tribe rests not within itself, but its association to the favored tribe of Judah. The region encompassed by these tribes have been called the Kingdom of Judah as well, though the exact nature of the border within each tribe is subject of debate. So as you read the scriptures, you see that Judah is the prominent tribe, and Simeon's area is kind of enclosed. If you can see over here, the map, I don't know how big it is on your screen, is in there. Now, there is a famous place in there. I'm pretty sure the wells of Beersheba were in the tribe of Simeon's land. Might recall Colin doing a presentation on the wells of Beersheba in World War I. And in Genesis 42, verse 24, and he turned himself about from them and wept and returned to them again and communed with them and took from them Simeon and bound him before their eyes. Now that's referring to the time when Joseph was in the land of Egypt, and when he kept one of the brothers back, it was Simeon he kept back. And the reason he kept probably Simeon back was, you might remember that before Joseph was going to be went into slavery, Simeon actually probably wanted to kill him, and it was Reuben that stepped in and actually stopped him from killing him. So that violence again coming in, and without going into all of that, if you were, sometimes you might look and say, oh, he's a baddie, he's a nasty, but the fact is that family was dysfunctional. I mean, how would you feel when Jacob was going to meet Esau and he kept Joseph and Benjamin at the back and he kept Simeon and others up the front? That kind of told you where you were in the family favor. So you can see why this jealousy would have built up, etc. And it's no, I don't think it's coincidence that Joseph held him back. Maybe he was the least favorite because he was the cruelest at the time. In the blessings of Moses, Simeon's actually not even mentioned. So so Jacob gave a blessing, and also Moses gave a blessing to the tribes. You can read that yourself. So Jacob's blessing was, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Again, he's referring, their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter their council. Let me not join their assembly, for they have killed in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they please. So they actually, even when they were kind of being lads, they were very cruel to the oxen. The way sometimes when you're kids, you might be a bit, you might do some scientific experiments and think it's funny when you're a kid. I'm sure some of the boys have done things like that to snails and other things like that. Maybe some people did it to people. I don't know. Anyway, cursed be their anger, so fierce and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. So the Lord is using in these blessings to explain some of the characteristics that are in these tribes, some of the traits that are in these tribes, and the fact that when Israel would become dispersed, as we know later on down the line, Israel got removed eventually from Palestine. Only Judah and a bit of Benjamin has possibly gone back there. So Simeon and Levi are somewhere in the midst of what's known as biblical Israel. And for most of us, we would know biblical Israel, if you've been around the fellowship, is the Anglo-Saxon Celtic peoples. Not that they're any more special than anyone else. It's just that God had made promises that he kept to them. It's interesting in Revelations, you know, some of the tribes are mentioned. Dan actually isn't, but Simeon actually is when it goes through about the 12,000 and the 144,000. So that's just to kind of give you what's there with Simeon in the background. Now we'll come back to Simeon and his journey. The thing about Simeon and some of the tribes as they move, they sometimes move with each other. Some of them move in singular, some of them move with other tribes as they move along. Did I want to go through that? It might be, I won't go through every one of these, but just to some of the promises that are made in these covenants. In Deuteronomy, in chapters 29 and 30, the Lord had said the blessings and the cursing on Israel dependent on their behavior. So that one was dependent on behavior. Let's go to 2 Samuel for a second, chapter 7, just to remind us of the Lord's promises, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to get back to see if what God's promises were made, did they come to pass? Are you okay, Rachel?
Yes, I'm okay.
Yeah. Okay, so in 2 Samuel in chapter 7, and in verse 10, it says, so I kind of alluded to this earlier. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more, neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time. And he goes on to talk in verse 13 that he would build a house, talking about David and his seed and his kingdom that would come from his bowels. In verse 13, he will build a house for not my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And that his mercy wouldn't be removed. And even though from time to time Israel would misbehave, God's loving kindness would always be there for them. So we see that this is kind of an unconditional promise, in the sense that God was going to move them, that they were never going to stay in Palestine forever. He was going to move them to an appointed place, all the way back in 2 Samuel. And in the spiritual sense, obviously we know some of these scriptures. We might just flick to Jeremiah chapter 31 for a sec. I could probably paraphrase them. In verse 31, behold, the days come, saith the Lord. He's really talking about a new covenant, which we know would be the New Testament. That I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be my covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law on their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no man every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, know the Lord, for They shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. And really in Ezekiel, it talks about the same kind of thing. So we could see further down the line that the Lord was going to use Israel. He was going to move them somewhere else to an appointed place, and that they would be his vehicle for the new covenant. And for many of us, we know the end of the story, in the sense that eventually, through Britain and America in particular, that the Bible and the latter rain started to come from them. So we know the end of the story. So now we're going to go back to seeing maybe, you know, the thing is about all this is you can never put the A to Z exactly. You get indications from scripture about the movement of Israel, and maybe from some history as well. You could get some indications, but you could never hang your hat and say this is definitely how it happened. And I want to emphasize that very clearly at the beginning. So as we move through this, I'm suggesting that the next few things possibly happened. And we're going to start back, I think, in Israel, or not in Israel, in Egypt. So we know the story of where Joseph and his brothers, after he was the second in command in Egypt, that eventually they stayed in Egypt for quite a considerable amount of time. And further on, way down the line, we know that the pharaohs started to forget who Israel and who Joseph really was. But some stuff actually happened in between. We think of the Exodus, and there's a main Exodus where the main body of Israel moved towards the promised land. Well, I'm going to suggest that before that happened, that there were already movements of some of the tribes of Israel out of Egypt, and also as they moved towards the promised land in the book of Numbers and things like that, that there's a possibility that some of the tribes also started to move towards other countries, that there wasn't just one, there's one main exodus, as in an exodus of the people, but also there's other, because it's a considerable amount of history, a time period in between when Israel were in Egypt. Remember, they only went down as probably, what, 70 people off the top of my head, Jacob and all the brothers and the wives and stuff like that. And by the time they leave, we're talking probably close to 1 million people, if possible. Like, it's a nation. So there's quite a considerable lot that's happened in between. So there's a bit of research that reveals that in the midst of the pharaohs, there's often from what's held as the common thought is that there was an uprising, not an uprising, sorry, an invasion came into Egypt called the Hyksos dynasty. So I'm not asking you to remember the names of everything, but we will explain that name. But now there's another thought that perhaps this was a rising up of the immigrants that were already in that country. And I'm going to suggest that there's a possibility that that may have been some of Israel. And if we just read this, it says, popular lore suggests that the Hyksos, a mysterious group of foreign invaders, conquered the Nile Delta around 1638 BC and remained in power until 1530. So they were in power for about 108 years. You know, and 108 years ago, if you like, you know, Ireland was still under Britain. So a lot can happen in 100 years. If you looked at a map of Europe 100 years ago, was very different to the map of Europe that's there now today. And we just flick through things and a lot of history can happen. And it goes on to, now new research lends way to an alternative theory on the Hyksos origin, says Colin Barras reports for Science magazine. Chemical analysis of skeletons found around the Hyksos capital of Avars indicates that the people from the Levant. Now, the Levant is the area of Israel. It is the area of Syria. It is that kind of area that we kind of associate around Tyre and Lebanon and stuff like that. Now, just think about it. At the same time, Israel is growing up as a country within Egypt, and an area incorporated to Egypt centuries before the time down into Egypt, and the Hyksos dynasty then uprising, not a hostile outside invasion, which is what most people have always thought. The researchers theorized that the members of the Avars immigrant community rose to power during the unrest of the Second Intermediary Period. After ruling northern Egypt for more than 100 years, they were disposed by the returning pharaohs, which would lend weight to the fact that they forgot about who Joseph is. I mean, who can remember anybody personally from 100 years ago, let alone a further back in time? Per science, historians have previously speculated that when the pharaohs reclaimed the territory, they excised the Hyksos rulers to the Southwest Asia, a move that may have inspired the biblical story of Exodus. Now, it's funny, Helen Duncan has left a few charts, and I happened to be reading this a few weeks ago, and not that she's relaying to the same thought that I'm saying, but, or maybe she does, but she never mentioned it, but just in what she's saying kind of lends a bit of weight to it. She gives this: the new kingdom of Egypt. When the weak pharaohs and power struggles led to the fall of the middle kingdom, the Hyksos ruled Egypt from 1640 to 1570. Warlike rulers began to restore Egypt's power and overthrow the Hyksos. Being the last of the Hyksos pharaohs, it took 15 years to drive the Hyksos north again. There is no record that these two peoples, the Hyksos and the children of Israel, had any strife living together in Egypt. Both were from the north, and both were to leave Egypt. The Hyksos around the time in the reign of Pharaoh Apipi, and the children of Israel later in 1495. There obviously was strife at this time, and it was not only persecution by the Egyptians against the Hyksos, but also starting against the children of Israel. So I'm going to suggest possibly that when we're referring to the children of Israel here, we're talking about the main Exodus that we know in the scriptures. And I'm going to suggest that the Hyksos were also Israelites. And we'll look at who they possibly are now in a second. So hopefully that makes sense, in the sense that there's this period in Egyptian history where people have risen up that were immigrants. I'm going to suggest that it's possibly some of the children of Israel before, when the Egyptians regained the whole control of the land of Egypt. Just to lend some dates here, we were talking here of 1640 to 1570. So just to put some kind of what do they call it? The word escapes me now. Chronology, the timeline of events. So here we see the call of Abraham in 1925 BC. Think about we're talking 2021 AD. So we're going back nearly the same period of time before Christ. We had the call of Abraham. In 1710, Jacob goes to Egypt. And in 1495 is the Exodus. So we're talking about this period of time in between, Later on, we know about when Israel eventually goes into Palestine, that there's two main further migrations of people when the house of Israel up the north fall to the Assyrians, and people are scattered then, which we know in the fellowship a lot. And later on, the house of Judah in 586 with the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonians coming in and taking over then. So we know those. So I'm just coming back to this period of time between 1710 to 1495 BC. There's a bit of reading here, but bear with it just to give a bit of background to who the Hyksos are, because it's going to link possibly to the Zerah tribe of Judah. So Zerah, you might remember in the Old Testament about Tamar when she has twins, and the first child comes out, Zarah gets the red thing around the wrist. Later, the other baby comes out, Pharez. And on the Pharez line leads down to David. But the Zerah line was the first one. And that red hand, of course, is very common to us in Ireland because it represents the red hand of Ulster, which is a province in Ireland, and also some of the other famous names in Ireland, like the O'Neills. So let's have a quick read of this. Is it possible that Zerah was recognized as the firstborn, legally speaking? If so, his name implies, as the scarlet thread used to identify the birthright holder implies, that he, Zerah, would be the rightful ruler upon the death of Judah. So Judah was Jacob's brother, and he would have died in Egypt. We must now move into an area of supposition because of the lack in the historical record. Think about it. We're going back 4,000 years. It's hard to get concrete stuff from even 2,000 years ago. So just bear that in mind. We do suspect, however, that there is a record to verify our conclusions somewhere awaiting discovery. The plan of God is unfolding in these last days and at an accelerated rate which challenges us to keep up with it. He will accomplish his purpose. He will reveal his plan in his time, etc., etc. Let's go down to the third paragraph. Our supposition is based upon 4 facts, but without strong support and evidence, because you can't say this for concrete. I'm suggesting it. I have to keep saying that. We are suggesting that Zerah, or one of his sons, did rule over Egypt for a period of time. We are also suggesting that God in his infinite wisdom and plans are determined to do so. It is not critically important that we prove that Zerah's descendants ruled in Egypt, because Zerah's sons did rule elsewhere after leaving Egypt, and we'll come to that, which is really talking about Ireland. Our supposition is based upon the writings of the Egyptian historian Manetho, who spoke of the Hyksos, or shepherd kings. And this is very important. According to David Walsh, Manetho says that HYK means kings and SOS means shepherds in the Egyptian language. We surmise that the rulers from Zerah, branch of Judah, were known as the shepherd kings. What and who are the shepherd kings? We know that Jacob and Israel and his sons were shepherds. We also know that Joseph cautioned his brothers about their occupation because a shepherd was an abomination to Egypt. And he quotes in Genesis chapter 46 about, especially in verse 34, that ye shall say, thy servant's trade had been about cattle from our youth, even until now, both we and also our fathers, that we may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. So it couldn't have been Egyptians if the word Hyksos means shepherd kings. It lends way that it was possibly, well, it was definitely someone else. And we're possibly saying that there's a possibility that it may have been the tribe of Judah through the Zerah line. The Hyksos or shepherd kings, ruled over the Egyptians who detested them and eventually overthrew them. The Egyptians from the southern part of Egypt revolted and regained the rulership of the country. If upon the death of Joseph, a Zara birthright holder succeeded Joseph upon the throne of Egypt, they would have been considered to be the foreign Hyksos kings. There are archaeological artifacts from the period with Hebrew names, which also supports this supposition. There is also a scripture that would support this idea. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. And a new Pharaoh came from Egypt, would not know Joseph since he had died some years previously, maybe a generation or two, overthrown the Hyksos, relieved them of the abomination of the foreign shepherd kings ruling over them. But they now had another problem. The children of Israel had multiplied greatly and outnumbered the Egyptians. It also states that they were mightier than the Egyptians, which would indicate a military power established while the Hyksos ruled. Again, we are surmising that the Hyksos were these Zarah-ites. Just further down in the last paragraph, the last line, it is sufficient to identify the names of the important rulers who exited from Egypt. Two of these names are Zara's son's name, Kalkal and Darda, and the others are Cadmus and Danas. The exceeding was a lengthy diversion from the main birthright, but necessary. It included the Zerah branch of Judah in the study of the birthright. We'll come back a bit to the birthright, but I just want to make the point that here is already people leaving before the main exodus into the promised land, which makes sense. People move all the time. It doesn't just happen in our modern time, which is what we're taught. So there's a big possibility, or maybe not big, but there's a possibility that the Hyksos kings, the shepherd kings, may be linked to the Zara line of Judah, and that when the Egyptian pharaohs from the south regained the land, they would have got out of the country. Just like later on in Israel's history, you know, not everybody waited around till the Assyrians attacked the country. If you knew you were going to be defeated, most people actually migrate. Look at Syria in our modern time. So just to bear that in mind as we move on. Now, the second one that we come to is as we go through the book of Numbers. I was hoping I pulled that screen, or maybe I did. There's actually two. So we've moved now into the main body of the Exodus that we're all familiar with. Moses, the commandments as they moved through the promised lands, and how the Israelites tended to be great at whinging, and the Lord did many miracles. Now, there's two census taken in the book of Numbers. The first census and the second census, and we see the net change. So the biggest change is in the tribe of Simeon. In the third column, you can see that they've gone down by 37,100, which is quite a considerable number of, and I'm pretty sure this was the number of men that could go to battle. This doesn't include women and children. So you can see that, you know, under both census, there's more or less 600,000 men. But within the tribes, and in particular in the tribe of Simeon, is a pretty dramatic drop off. So why did that happen? So the second census is in 1407. And if some of us might know this, in the book of Numbers, this is not from the King James. You might recall the story of Balaam and the donkey. And when Balaam was defeated, he used subtlety to get the Moabites to bring in the nicest of women to entice the Israelites. And there's a guy called Pinus, who's actually from the tribe of Levi. Now remember, Levi and Simeon are pretty hot-headed. We read that earlier, cruelty's in their nature. That's why, as I've often mentioned, the Lord redirected Levi to be the butchers. They became the priestly tribe, and he redirected that if you like, streak of violence to something constructive, where they used to chop up all the animals when they did the sacrifice. So that's redirecting it. Well, here, while Israel remained at Shittim, the people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. The Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and execute them in the broad daylight before the Lord, so that the fierce anger of the Lord might turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of the people, each of you slay men who have joined himself to Baal of Peor. Now Zimri, an Israelite leader who probably had carried out the execution of defenders, brings in a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses in the aftermath of this incident. We are told he brought this woman into the sight of Moses, which seems somewhat confrontational, notwithstanding that the execution had just taken place. Then behold, one of the sons of Israel came and brought to his relatives a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the congregation of the sons of Israel while they were weeping at the doorway of the tent of Israel. It seems strange for Zimri to have done this immediately after the execution of the offenders, other than to challenge Moses, who happened to have married a Midianite. Could this incident be more deeper than a casual sexual encounter with a princess of the Midianites? Could Zimri have been challenging Moses's leadership? So in this moment where there's high emotion after the Lord's kind of had to bring a plague on Israel because they played the harlot, and then this prince of the tribe of Simeon almost confronts Moses by bringing in a woman and kind of almost, I think actually if you read deeper, he actually married her. And he brings it in trying to form this alliance, this marital alliance. And Pinus gets the javelin and he throws it and he kills Zimri. So if you're in the tribe of Simeon and you're in the tribe of Levi, who are both pretty hot-headed, there could have been easily a civil war between the tribes of Israel, in particular with Simeon. And maybe I'm suggesting, yes, some of them got killed in the plague, but I'm going to suggest that a portion of the tribe of Simeon may well have made an exodus from the main body at this point in time. And that's why I have, are you leaving already? And it's interesting, we will see, you know, what's his name? Dave Furness did a presentation on the pre-Adamic man, and he talked about how even back then there was already trade routes, and there's trade routes that have been going from the Middle East all the way over to the British Isles for about 2,000 years already. I've just pulled this out, that the Cornish mining started 2000 BC. I'm going to show you a map here that we will trace to see, you know, that there's a number of different migrations of the tribes of Israel through the sea. I'm not going to do every one of them, but obviously a lot of them went over land as well. But in particular, we're going to start to follow maybe the tribe of Simeon, a bit of Dan, and the tribe of Judah, how they moved, not necessarily all as we see in the main body of Israel, but that there was already people leaving the main body, I think, possibly before what we would see in as the main body making to Palestine, and then later on parting off between when the house of Israel fell and the house of Judah fell. I think, yeah, just there's 3 more slides. Bear with me, we're nearly there, because I just want to finish at this point before we. So in the Song of Deborah in Judges chapter 5, just to show, you know, we've moved from, you know, Genesis, where we were in Egypt with the Hyksos. We move into Numbers, where we see possibly Simeon, and maybe some of the other parts of the tribes started to leave the main body. Obviously, some of the tribe of Simeon obviously stayed with the main body, but some of them left. And there's also in Judges in chapter 5, when Deborah has to go out and fight, she says in the Song of Deborah, she starts to say, where's the tribe of Dan? Why isn't he at the fight? And it says he stayed on their ships with their belongings. It also actually talks about Reuben staying in the vineyards. So we can see another possibility is that Simeon, along with Judah, had simply not joined the Israelite Confederacy at this point, or they had ceded. So, you know, maybe I never really considered these things before. Then not all of them actually stayed and did the same thing. And when you look at the scriptures, you can see that, you get glimpses into that. We know that Dan is probably linked to what's called the Sea People. And later on, we'll see that when he came to Ireland, he became known as the Tuatha Danann. Now, they came into Ireland in probably maybe somewhere between 1500 BC and 2000 BC. So it's in that kind of time span that we're talking about. It's not when the house of Israel fell, way down the line in 750, whatever it was, BC. We can see that it says here that the Sea Peoples may have been actually, Caesarea is the guy who Deborah actually goes out to fight in the book of Judges. And he may have come from Sardinia, not too sure. He seemed to come to fight Ramses III, according to some carvings in Egypt. We start to find Dan is one of the first people into Greece. The Danoni are one of the first people into Greece, a long time before the main body of Israel even started to get into Palestine. And also later on down the line, we're going to see possibly a link between the Spartans and the tribes of Israel. It's interesting that Samson, who comes from the tribe of Dan, most people know about Hercules, who's the Greek strong man. Obviously, we've got Paddy in Ireland, but the Greeks had Hercules, and it's just rebranding, I think. And the snake and the eagle are prominent emblems when we get to see the Battle of Troy and who the Trojans were, and maybe who the Spartans were as well, that it's not Greeks. I think this, just let me see, maybe that's enough for tonight.